now like to invite Dr. Gerard Jansen, and he's going to talk about the New Brunswick cluster, the mystery disease, as the media called it. And it is quite an interesting story. Thank you, Gerard.
You're very welcome. Gosh. So yes, indeed, we're going to talk about the New Brunswick cluster of neurological syndrome of unknown cause, as it's officially named by the authorities. Am I doing something wrong? I guess I'm doing something wrong. Yeah, it should be fine, right? It's this, yeah, this report. Okay. It's just slow. That's the problem. It's the right hand. Okay. Well, just to let you know, I wasn't always in Canada. I was also in Europe. And I've been working 31 years on CJD, both as pathologist, clinical work for the CJD surveillance. And I think what's the most important takeaway from here is that until last year, I was working for the Canadian CJD surveillance as the clinical person. I'm still the pathologist, even though that may be cut short any time now. I don't know. And that has to do with actually what I'm going to tell you. Oh. There we go. So no conflict of interest. And I know that you're not looking into whether or not I have a conflict of interest, but it's actually important here because I have negative conflicts of interest. Pathologists usually don't earn money from whatever presentation they do. We're kind of like on the lower end of the salary scale usually, and no big companies have interest in us. But I've been threatened. There would be people with guns in front of my house. I've been threatened with investigations. I've been having smear campaigns with letters to my significant superiors, complaints against my licensing body over me. So this is all to pique your interest a little bit. So for those who snoozed during geography in middle school, I don't know if you have middle school over here. We do. Basically, what is New Brunswick? New Brunswick is a tiny province in Canada. It's one of the smallest. It's only covers 73,000 square kilometers and has 750,000 inhabitants, 750,000. And it's therefore 15% larger than Tasmania. And it actually has, if you look properly, it has the same shape almost. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So what about New Brunswick? So on March 17, 2021 was the first time the world learned about New Brunswick, I think. And it was the government of Brunswick by Jennifer Russell, who you can see here, when she was in a happier state, announced that there was a new neurological disease that had been found in a cluster of 48 patients. And this disease was referred to NSUC, as I already mentioned to you. Now, a case definition had been dispersed among medical doctors. This was a very loose case definition, very vague. And this investigation had already started since the end of 2019 with this, the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease surveillance in Canada. But the provinces took that investigation over in June 2021 because they were very unhappy. And as a result of that investigation they did themselves in February 24 of this year, they actually decided that there was no such thing as a mystery disease. So I'm going to, with that, I'm sharing you already the outcome. But what really happened? So from end of 2019 to April 2021, 46 patients have been reported to the CJD surveillance as having a new disease by one neurologist only. Now, the CJD surveillance is part of the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is federal government. That's something you need to know. And then in March and April 2021, 2 additional patients have been added by 2 other neurologists, and they did so because they felt obliged since this description had been circulated. Now, in press interviews from March 2021 onwards, suggestions were made for environmental causes for this cluster. And the first one was chronic wasting disease in deer and elk. Deer and elk are very common in New Brunswick. Actually, if you drive at night, you have a high chance of a collision. And people then take that roadkill into the back of their pickup truck for suitable consumption. Okay, and then later, a couple of weeks later, all of a sudden that changed into blooms of blue-green algae, or if you want, cyanobacteria. So those suggestions are actually made by 3 people mainly. And most people don't realize they are interconnected. That was the referring neurologist of the 46, the head of the CJD surveillance system, who is not a medical doctor, and to the CJD surveillance liaison neurologist in another part of the country, but not naming names. Now, 10 patients died, of whom 8 came to autopsy. Yep. So what is actually has been said here? Well, the first thing is, obviously, we know that we have TSEs in animals, and thank you, Steve and Catriona and Richard for giving me some groundwork here, so I don't have to do that much. As you know, there is chronic wasting disease in animals, and there is BSE there, and BSE has given rise to variant CJD. So the suggestion here is that chronic wasting disease would produce a new disease in humans. It had never been described before, human chronic wasting disease. Now, as you all have heard, in our clinical diagnosis of prion diseases, the pillars nowadays of diagnosis are CSF, and especially the quick test, and MRI, FLAIR, and EWI with hyperintensity in the basal ganglia and in the neocortex. In pathology, we are happy to see the vacuoles, spongiosis, and our prion protein immunohistochemistry or synaptic pattern, and a multicentric pattern, which is found in Gerstrom-Strauss-Scheinker syndrome. And of course, if we have frozen tissue, you can do a Western blot for confirmation. However, the interesting part was, since I was part of the CJD surveillance clinical side at the onset to end of 2019, 2020, up to September 21, that I had access to these patients' files and I could see them. And the problem was, there was nothing of this nature in any of these patients. And when I confronted people about this, was, oh yeah, but this must be human chronic wasting disease because they all ate deer and moose meat. I was like puzzled by that expression. So I looked very much forward to actually seeing some of that in autopsy patient, because I was promised that we would get a lot of autopsies of these patients. So I shut up and continued. So the patients who passed away, respectively, were 3 cases in 2020 and 3 cases in 2021. And then just before the first case in 2021, this doctor of the 46 patient realized he had 2 older cases that had also been seen by the CJD surveillance, also come to autopsy. So those were included at that point in time too. So with those 8, so they all were selected, basically all these 8, by the neurologists in question. And then further, when I ultimately presented my results to this oversight committee, this provincial committee that was investigating, because information transmission between the federal government and this committee was non-existent, I felt obliged to actually start to inform some people. They also confirmed that these 8 cases were part of their group of investigation. So we received brain tissue. 7 of the cases was partly fixed in formalin, partly frozen. And in 1 case, it was formalin fixed paraffin embedded tissue only. So what we do? We did our routine work. We did immunohistochemistry, as you now have heard of. And the most important thing is that we did a prion protein stain 12F10 clone. And 12F10 doesn't only recognize human prion protein in sporadic CJD, but it also recognizes prion protein of chronic wasting disease, which is very handy in this case, obviously. We did some other stains for other neurodegenerative diseases, allowing us to make alternate diagnosis as needed. Now, usually, since I'm the central pathologist for Canada, I only look at the cases and nobody else. Because of some pressures, I felt very compelled to involve another colleague to also have a look at the cases and provide me with an independent review. And actually, 3 of the cases had 3 neuropathologists involved. So it was even better. And we could also do a Western blot in 7 cases. So what are the most important findings? There was no typical spongiosis in any of these patients. There was some spongiosis, but not typical for CJD. There was no staining, as you can see here, for prion protein in any of these patients. Western blot was done on the 7 cases with frozen tissue, no signals found. And more importantly, there were individually different pathologies per patient. Now, what do I mean with that? Several patients had bad amyloid plaques in a bad amyloid stain, very convincing, many neurofibrillary tangles, classic for Alzheimer's disease. 1 patient with many infarcts in the brain, including a hemorrhagic infarct. Patients with Lewy bodies in the neocortex, confirmed by a synuclein stain, that's a stain that shows Lewy bodies. A patient with carcinoma met in the brain. And 1 patient with spongiosis, but not in the right place, in the upper cortex, combined with TDP-43 inclusions. And that is a hallmark of frontotemporal dementia. Well, that was interesting, right? So overall, if you look at these 8 patients, none of prion protein, Western blot is negative. And then through morphology combined with immunohistochemistry, we came to a couple of primary diagnoses and some secondary diagnoses in all of these patients. 2 patients with Alzheimer's disease, 1 patient with vascular dementia, 2 patients with dementia with Lewy bodies, 1 frontotemporal dementia case, 1 metastatic carcinoma. And hey, this is interesting, no morphological abnormalities in 1. Now, I'm not going to disclose too much about the clinical histories about these patients because I've been told that I cannot. But this patient has had psychiatric symptoms of schizophrenia many years before and decided to stop taking her meds. And she came in what we call catatonia. And as a result of that, she passed away. But our principal neurologist in this story saw this patient in consultation and said, no, this is my new disease. And she is part of this. Okay. The order of the cases in this table is not chronological in any way. And when you see this and you kind of look back maybe at news stories, you will not be able to identify patients by this. And I have to say that because that has also been a source of a complaint to me. So. Now, what does it mean? The clinical input is an unknown new neurological syndrome or human chronic wasting disease. And the pathology output is conventional and individually different diseases. No prion disease, no new disease, explaining each of the patient's symptoms well. So I could only come up that this was misdiagnosis of our neurologist. But the big question obviously is, is that representative for the cluster as a whole? We have 48 patients. Are these 8 patients representative for that? And I had a hard time thinking of statistics for how to prove this. Because let's face it, we have apples, cherries, lemons, pineapples, watermelons, bananas in this group. How do you show this cohesiveness in a group by statistics? And I was like, it took me a few weeks to actually get there, because I had the whole time the feeling that I was running behind the facts. So then I thought, okay, these are all fruits. They're not vegetables. And as a result of that, what if these cases are actually incidental mistakes where a referring neurologist did not recognize his newly found disease? So what would then be the probability that such a thing could happen, that we would have 8 consecutive cases where he missed his disease? So that's roughly what we're looking at. That probability is actually P in statistical analysis, because it's the chance that we make a wrong decision. So we would then decide that if P would be larger than 5%, we would have incidental errors. That's the null hypothesis. And if P is smaller than 5%, these errors would be representative for the cluster. This is how statistics works. Now, how do we decide that? So we need to know how many errors a neurologist can make. I think there's actually a lot that they can make. I'm sorry, Steve and Rich. But, you know, in all reality, most pathologists know that clinical dementia diagnosis is really hard, because we sometimes see things that are just a little bit different than clinically was thought. So I actually started out with this by asking my friends and family what they would expect of their neurologist. And the numbers that came back were staggering. 95 to 99% certain of diagnosis. And I said, oh, yeah, that's not my experience. Then I went to neurologists and I polled 20 of them. And the numbers that came back were 75 to 85%, which sounded a little better to me. And it was actually quite revealing that the older the neurologist, the lower the percentage that came out. And I think that's wisdom, what you see there. And I thought, no, this is not scientific, what I'm doing. So I tried to find a study, and actually I found a fairly recent study that was just a clinical pathological correlation study. And what they did was have, for a brain bank where patients had been studied beforehand, the studies had not been done all by expert neurologists or anything. Very wide-ranging group of people that looked at these patients, and they had to put them in 6 categories of different types of dementia, including one category called normal. That sounds like the kind of study that we're looking for. And that quoted 63.9% diagnostic acumen, meaning that we would have 36.1% of wrong diagnoses. So with that number, you can actually calculate that from the 48, if we use this study, we would have 17.3 errors in our group. And then maybe, if I kind of round it up, 18 errors and 30 NSUC cases if that disease actually even exists. And now it becomes super simple. This brings you back to high school, at least I think so. At least it's, for me, this was high school. It is a jar of marbles. So we have now a jar of 48 marbles. 18 of them are errors, are red, 30 are blue. What's the chance that I pull 8 red marbles from that jar? And that is, obviously, the first one is 18 because we've got 18 errors. and 48 marbles in the jar. The second one becomes 17 errors we've got left and 47 marbles in the jar, and we can continue. And the outcome is 116 per million. And that rounded is 1 in 10,000, or P is 0.0001. So basically, this is called using classic probability theorem. I had somebody else look over my results because I felt a little uncomfortable that it was so easy in the end. And this was what the name was that was put on it. Apparently, that's it. So basically, given this low p-value, we now know that our null hypothesis that it were errors is rejected, and therefore we know that the errors are actually representative of the cluster as a whole. Now, second thing is even more interesting, because now we have a model that we can use. So in which case did we have the first time statistical significance? And that's the third case. And that was verbally reported to the CJD surveillance 1 month before everything went haywire and they involved the international and national media. Interesting, huh? They had 12 statisticians and epidemiologists on this problem. I either didn't come up with it or knew it. I don't know. So I've received comments on these statistics. Cannot be true because, well, there was one more. I don't believe this calculation. That was one too. But the ones that made some sense were there are more people right in this cluster that will influence statistics. And I thought, okay, the diagnostic acumen is assumed too high. And the third one, not all these patients are from this referring doctor. And that what was true. Like one of these patients was from another neurologist. So the first and the second I can solve quite easily. If we increase the number of patients in the cluster with this model, what you see actually, and if you lower the diagnostic acumen, you can see actually that it plateaus out. Now that's interesting. I had another slide which I took out, was basically there's a formula that has been made is mind is blown to the power of holy crap. And that is a moment that I actually had at that point when I had done this evaluation. But you can actually see if we increase with our 64% diagnostic acumen, 63.9, that actually we will never reach statistical significance of 5%. If we go to 50%, that also doesn't happen. We have to lower the diagnostic acumen to 31.2%, which means that almost 70% of the diagnoses are wrong. Now, there's something wrong with that. Because in the paper that I used for the statistical analysis and the guessing how many patients were erroneous, they had 6 categories to divide these patients in. While in this case, you either have a new disease or it's an old disease that you know already. You can solve that if you're unsure about what you should say. You could flip a coin and then you have an answer. So basically 50% is your gamble margin there, your Monte Carlo correction, if you like. And that basically means that you will never get to diagnostic acumens below 50%. It's impossible. If you do that, you gamble against yourself. That's weird. It's almost like a med student sitting for an exam with yes and no questions and saying, okay, this question I know. The answer is yes, so I'll say no. So if you tabulize this, we have basically 63.9% diagnostic acumen. We had already this number here with 48 patients, 1 per 10,000. If we make the cluster infinitely large, then we reach P is 3 per 10,000. So it's still comfortably statistically significant. 50% diagnostic acumen, those numbers are 2 per 1,000 and 4 per 1,000. Still wonderfully within the margin of 5%. Now, we can do the same thing if we eliminate one of the autopsy patients who was from another neurologist, because then we have 46 patients, 1 neurologist, 7 autopsies. And then we get to 4 in 10,000. If we make the numbers infinite, 8 per 10,000. If we lower the diagnostic acumen, 5 per 1,000 and 8 per 1,000. Doesn't matter. Whatever we do, it remains under our critical border for statistical significance. Whatever we try to manipulate with these numbers, these patients, these 8 patients or 7 patients, whatever you want to take, represent the cluster as a whole. The cluster does not exist except that the cluster surrounds this neurologist, and that's all. So let's get back to the hypothesis. Chronic wasting disease in humans has never been described. That's for the first one. There's no evidence for a prion disease in these 8 cases. And with the statistics, we've shown that basically the chance is very low that we have something new to be found in this group. There's also insufficient evidence for chronic wasting disease in deer and moose in New Brunswick. And there's no atypical neurological disease in areas in Canada where we have endemic chronic wasting disease. And I can show you that. Here's the recent map for chronic wasting disease. Here's New Brunswick. Sorry, I gotta do it like this. Oops. Now that was not something I wanted. Can you correct that or shall I? Oh, man, that was a bad choice of mine. Yeah, thank you. That is great. That is excellent. So here is New Brunswick. And as you can see, the closest source for chronic wasting disease is there, which is 1,050 kilometers. Now, this inoculation should have happened a while ago, so makes no sense that that could have happened. There's nothing in New Brunswick. So I wouldn't even have the idea why that would come from, that idea that we would have chronic wasting disease, created disease. Plus, there's, I think, passports that these deer would need to cross the border and other stuff. It, you know, doesn't make any sense. Now let's go to the other hypothesis, because I've never said anything about that. The blue-green algae. So the hypothesis that was presented was that blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria, blooms would generate toxic amino acids. And what was mentioned was beta-methylaminoalanine. And that those would cause misfolding of neuronal proteins, generating all kinds of misfolding diseases. Now, what was said that they would create different diseases in different patients, like Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia. And that would have caused this cluster. It sounds a little bit weird, because if this mechanism would work, you would have people with all kinds of neurodegenerative features in one person. But okay, let's leave that for what it is. Now, blue-green algae causing misfolding diseases has been suggested by some very enthusiastic researchers. It's a small group of investigators. There have been some patchy correlations in some diseases. However, there is no general accepted method for even measuring BMAA in fluids or tissues. So it's never any proof that is significantly valuable that has been made public. More importantly, 3/8 cases are not misfolding disease. And actually, at the presentation of the hypothesis, that was 2 out of 5, 40%. I've never heard of any researcher who would be happy that 40% of their most investigated cases would totally miss the mark. More importantly, there is no BMAA specific symptom. So how could you even consider taking this cause, if you like, into consideration? What made you come up with that? Further, causative factors do not create symptoms in neurological diseases. It's the failure of those systems that create that. And as a result of that, if we see somebody pathologically who has Alzheimer's disease, you would expect the symptoms to be there of that disease in some shape or form. And therefore, you would at least be able to suggest that diagnosis. Actually, retrospectively, I could see that in all these patients' files, even before they died, what the differential diagnosis should have been that never were made. So the presentation would never be, I see too many cases of Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia, or would be, I see too many cases of Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body, and never I've seen a new disease. That is weird. When you think all of a sudden that you recognized Alzheimer's disease, calling it a new disease, it really makes no sense at all. And also then, in that case, the presentation would not have been to the CJD surveillance, the national one. It would have been to local public health saying, I see too many cases of Alzheimer's disease. Look into the tap order. There must be something in there. So in my view, and also if you look at the chronological history of this is an attempt to name and rebrand new disease to old disease with a new cause. And actually that was based on the fact of the outcome of the autopsies. It was an attempt to basically adapt a new hypothesis to the outcome of the findings. It's very strange. So these 8 patients who passed away show individually different conventional neurological diseases. The only possible explanation for the discrepancy is a clinical misclassification of these patients. What I did not say was that human chronic wasting disease cannot ever occur. It is a concern. There is some experimental evidence that this might occur in humans. So we have to keep on looking. What I also didn't say that BMAA cannot cause misfolding diseases. I find it really not a very likely hypothesis, but that's just me. What I want to say is that BMAA and chronic wasting disease in this cluster have nothing to do with it. It is caused by misclassifications, misdiagnosis, as was later on also confirmed by the oversight committee. Now, we're not talking about what the motivation was of certain individuals. But if later on you want to ask me, you can always ask me about that. So thank you so much. I have some people to thank who did help me with this investigation. People at my university. And yeah, anyone who wants to email me questions about it, other things, always there, always happy.